Picture this, a high-stakes project kickoff call, split screen between Buenos Aires and São Paulo. The project manager, bless him, thinks he's created a masterpiece. He shares his screen to reveal a color-coded symphony of a spreadsheet, individual tasks, time-stamped deadlines, and rigid risk assessments. For the team dialing in from Argentina, this was absolute gold. You could practically see them leaning into their webcams, laser-focused on their specific rows. They wanted the rules, the metrics, and the individual win. Their attitude was clear. Just tell me my lane, and I will drive the car. It was a perfect match for a mindset that craves structure and personal achievement. But then the Brazilian team unmuted, and the entire atmosphere shifted. They barely glanced at the checklist. Instead, they started asking about the who. Who reports to whom? Who holds the real influence? How do we navigate this as a group? The spreadsheet didn't matter anymore. The hierarchy did. You could watch the poor project manager's brain buffering in real time. He offered them a plan, but they were looking for a tribe. That awkward silence on the call wasn't just a communication breakdown. It was a collision between two invisible, powerful cultural operating systems, one running on a code of individual certainty, the other powered by collective hierarchy. And despite being neighbors, those codes are written in completely different languages. That opening story is it's so much more than a bit of corporate awkwardness across borders, isn't it? It perfectly frames what we're really digging into today.
It really does. It's the whole thesis in one anecdote.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to use this framework of cultural dimensions, I'm talking about Geert Hofstede's work, of course, to really get under the hood and analyze these invisible societal codes in Argentina and Brazil. We want to understand why that collision happened.
And how those same codes, those deep-seated cultural preferences, end up dictating everything from business behavior to, well, the entire economic performance of the nation.
Exactly. And how they shape their responses to a world that's changing faster than ever.
We're basically trying to reverse engineer the logic that guides these two, massive and incredibly complex Latin American societies. To an outsider, you might look at them on a map and think, okay, neighbors, they must be pretty similar.
Yeah, you assume a lot of overlap.
But when you actually analyze the data, you see this profound structural difference in how they organize themselves. And the core distinction, which is really going to be the theme for our entire conversation, is this. Argentina is culturally programmed for individualism, for personal achievement, and this is the crucial part, a really high demand for documented structure and certainty.
A spreadsheet.
A spreadsheet. Brazil, on the other hand, is built on a totally different foundation. It's about strong collective loyalty and a deep, deep acceptance of hierarchy. We call it high power distance. And that one fundamental difference is the key to unlocking their wildly divergent paths over the last 50 or 60 years.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's use the Hofstede framework itself to get specific. For anyone listening who might not be familiar with it, his work is sort of like a sociological MRI machine, right?
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
It gives us these quantifiable data points, these scores on a scale that let us deconstruct that societal code and really see the unspoken assumptions that drive behavior. It helps us get past stereotypes and into something measurable.
It gives us the diagnostic numbers for the operating system. And what's fascinating is that when you quantify these values, which are incredibly stable over time, you can start explaining almost everything, from how you run a meeting to why one economy is so much more volatile than another.
So where should we start? The I versus we seems like the most fundamental one.
Let's start there. Individualism versus collectivism, or IDV. This is that core spectrum of the individual's relationship to the group.
And where do Argentina and Brazil fall?
Well, Argentina scores a 51 on the Individualism Index. Now, on a global scale, that's pretty much middle of the road.
Right in the center.
But, and this is a huge but, when you view it inside the Latin American context, where collectivism is generally the dominant force, a score of 51 is actually quite high. It tells you that Argentine culture leans much more toward individualism, prioritizing things like personal freedom, self-reliance, and, chasing your own goals over the demands of the group.
You mentioned looser ties between people. How does that actually play out, like in an office or just in society?
It means the relationship between, say, an employer and an employee is seen as very contractual. It's a business arrangement. The employee is there to do a specific job. They expect to be measured on their individual performance, and they want to be rewarded for that personal win we talked about.
So loyalty is more to your own career path than to the company itself.
Exactly. Loyalty is primarily to yourself and your own progress. Professional relationships tend to be very task-oriented, not built on some deep, personal, lifelong obligation. This is what drives that famous Argentine personal initiative and that emphasis on individual rights. It perfectly explains why that team on the call was so laser-focused on their specific rows in the spreadsheet. What's my job? What's my metric?
It's all about the personal contract, the personal lane. Okay, so now let's contrast that with Brazil.
Brazil is a completely different story. They score a 38 on the IDV index. That puts them firmly in the collectivist camp.
A big 13-point swing.
A huge swing. For Brazilian society, your identity, your security, it's all fundamentally linked to strong, cohesive in-groups. This isn't just your immediate family, it's your extended family, your close social circle, your professional networks. These are the circles of trust.
And loyalty is the currency within that circle.
It's the essential currency. It's a two-way street. You give loyalty to the group, and in return, the group gives you protection, security, and access. It's a powerful system of mutual obligation.
Which means that when it comes to making a decision, it's not about some impersonal checklist. It's about what's best for the group. How do we maintain harmony?
Precisely. And individuals' actions are always viewed through the lens of how they affect the tribe. And that is why the Brazilian team's first instinct wasn't to look at the what in the spreadsheet, but to ask about the who. Who's in charge? Who has influence? How do we as a group navigate this together? Their societal code just compels them to see the world through the map of trusted relationships first.
Okay, that's a massive difference right there.
Yeah.
Let's move to the next dimension, which I think is where the gap gets even wider. The relationship with authority or power distance, PDI.
This is where the scores get really dramatic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what's Brazil's score?
Brazil scores a 69 on the power distance index. That's a very high score. It reflects a society that doesn't just tolerate unequal power distribution, it expects it, it accepts it, and in many ways, it encourages it.
Hierarchy is not a bad word. Not at all. It's the natural order of things. Authority is expected to be centralized, and subordinates show a very clear, very pronounced respect and deference to their superiors. Status symbols, the corner office, the title, the car, they aren't just perks. They're seen as legitimate markers of that authority.
In a high PDI society like Brazil, decision-making then must flow from the top down, almost exclusively.
It does. It rests very heavily at the top.
But I have to challenge that a bit. How does a society that requires every decision to travel up and down this rigid ladder successfully innovate? Or, achieve these efficiency-seeking goals we see their companies aiming for later on? It seems like it would be incredibly slow.
That's a fantastic question, and it's a common misconception. Innovation in a high PDI culture doesn't mean a junior person storms into the CEO's office with a brilliant idea. That would be a major social breach.
It would be seen as disrespectful.
Deeply disrespectful. It's not just a procedural error. Innovation means channeling your ideas up through the proper respected channels. You convince your direct manager, who convinces their director, and so on. Bypassing that hierarchy is seen as a chaotic act. The boss is expected to be almost paternalistic, to take complete responsibility, and the employees are, in turn, waiting for clear directions from that authority figure.
So any efficiency seeking, any major change, has to be sponsored and championed from the very top to be seen as legitimate.
It has to be ratified from the top. The structure itself is non-negotiable. Now, compare that to Argentina. Their PDI score is 49.
A full 20 points lower. That's enormous.
It's hugely revealing. Now, a 49 doesn't mean Argentina is some flat egalitarian paradise. It's still a hierarchical society. But that score signals a moderate PDI. There's a significantly lower degree of innate acceptance of power inequality compared to Brazil.
So, authority figures exist, but the deference isn't as automatic or intense.
Exactly. There's more room for negotiation, for engagement with your superiors. There's an expectation that you can push back a bit, provided, and this is key, provided that your engagement follows the established rules and procedures.
So the Argentine employee might be more willing to challenge a manager's decision.
Yes.
But only if they can point to a flaw in the process or a broken metric, a documented rule that isn't being followed.
You've nailed it. They value the merit of the rule and the documented process more than the inherent status of the person enforcing it. If a manager in Buenos Aires just tries to pull rank without backing it up with clear, predictable procedures, they're going to get pushed back. That goes against the cultural value placed on individual rights and, most importantly, on documented certainty.
And that craving for documented certainty brings us perfectly to the next dimension. Uncertainty avoidance, or UAI. And the data here for Argentina is, well, it's almost off the charts.
It is extreme. Argentina clocks in with a UAI score of 86. This signals a profound cultural preference for structure, clarity, predictability. This is a culture that carries a very high level of anxiety about the unknown, about ambiguous situations.
You have to imagine that's a direct reflection of decades
Okay.
of institutional instability, hyperinflation.
It's a culture that craves structure precisely because its institutions have been so structurally unreliable. It's a national trauma in a way.
So how do they manage that anxiety?
They build walls. Walls of strict rules, of formalism, of established procedures. There's a deep, deep need to feel like you can control the future by documenting every possible contingency. You see this everywhere, in the obsession with legal contracts, in detailed written communication, in a strong rejection of anything that feels fluid or open to interpretation.
They need the certainty of a known path.
Which is why that project manager's spreadsheet was, as the story said, absolute gold to the Argentine team. It was the documented path. It was the antidote to anxiety.
And Brazil. Their UAI is also high, but not quite at that level. Brazil scores a 76, so they are definitely risk-averse. They also value clear rules and prefer structure over chaos. But that 10-point difference is meaningful. It means they have a slightly higher comfort level with ambiguity than Argentines do.
So where an Argentine might demand the rule book be followed to the absolute letter to manage their anxiety,
A Brazilian might be more willing to rely on the strength of the relationship, that collective in-group, to manage the uncertainty. They might say, look, we don't know the exact rule here, but we trust the person in charge to figure it out for us. The trust is in the person, the leader, not just the document.
person versus process. Fascinating. Okay, let's quickly touch on the last dimension before we move on, the drive for success or achievement motivation.
Right, sometimes called masculinity versus femininity. Argentina scores a 56 here, which leans them towards the so-called masculine pole.
And what does that mean in practical terms? It translates to an environment where things like assertiveness, competition, and crucially visible accomplishment are highly valued. Success is something to be demonstrated, to be shown off. It's about winning. Brazil scores a 49, which is much closer to the center of the scale.
More balance.
Exactly. It indicates a greater balance between that competitive drive and other values, like cooperation, quality of life, caring for others. It's not that Brazilians aren't ambitious, but the Argentine environment simply places a stronger cultural premium on overt individual competition, which of course fits perfectly with their high individualism. It all connects.
We've laid out the cultural blueprints. Now let's see how these numbers actually translate into action. Let's revisit that kickoff call because it's such a perfect practical example of how these hidden codes create real-world problems.
We can fully diagnose it now, can't we? Let's take Santiago, the Argentine project lead. He's approaching this whole problem through the lens of his culture's UAI score of 86 and his IDV of 51.
The high uncertainty avoidance and the high individualism.
Right. So for him, creating that rigid, detailed Gantt chart with a full risk matrix isn't just good project management, it's a psychological necessity. For him, efficiency is planning. It's documenting everything to mitigate risk. He's looking at the project impersonally as a checklist of tasks to be individually conquered and won.
Meanwhile, João, his Brazilian counterpart, is running a completely different playbook in his head.
A completely different one. João's priorities are entirely social. They're driven by his high power distance of 69 and his collectivism score of 38. For him, that impersonal plan is, at best, a secondary document.
So what's the primary document?
The org chart.
The unwritten org chart, the map of influence. He knew that for his team to actually get on board and function, the project first had to be validated by the director, the highest power holder in the room. In his world, a spreadsheet can never, ever supersede the hierarchy.
You don't bypass the boss. You don't bypass the boss. And on top of that, his collectivist instinct told him he had to establish rapport first. He had to build trust, ensure the group felt harmonious. He needed what we call social lubrication. For João, efficiency isn't about the perfect plan. It's about skillfully navigating the social web to get collective buy-in.
So the core lesson here for any international manager is that you can't just export a single template for good management. The very definition of efficiency changes dramatically from one culture to the next.
It absolutely does. Success in a cross-cultural project like this means recognizing that if you're managing a Brazilian team, the social contract and the hierarchical affirmation have to come first. You need to build the relationship before you present the plan.
So what should Santiago have done differently?
If he had started the meeting by saying, I've already spoken with Director Silva and he's very excited about this, and then spent 10 minutes just building personal rapport, asking about their families, establishing that human connection, then the Gantt chart would have been seen as just a formality. Exactly. It would have been accepted as the necessary procedure, but because the Argentine team craves that documented certainty, Santiago was also right to provide that structure. He just failed to pair it with the social piece that his Brazilian counterparts needed to even begin the conversation.
That clash, the structure versus the network, is something that I think plays out not just in corporations, but in how entire economies function. Which brings us to the entrepreneurs. We have Valeria, the lone wolf in Argentina, and Felipe, the networker in Brazil. Tell me about Valeria.
Valeria is the perfect embodiment of her culture scores. She's operating in an environment where, currency crises, hyperinflation, and political chaos are not black swan events. They're the norm.
They're just Tuesday.
It's just Tuesday.
Yeah.
So given her high individualism, who does she rely on? Only herself. She has very little, if any, trust in the state, in the currency, in the regulatory environment. So when an economic shock hits, she doesn't sit around and wait for a government bailout or for her union to protect her. She acts instantly and independently.
And what does that action look like? What are these lone wolf survival tactics?
She pivots her business model at lightning speed. Her absolute priority is to get her hands on hard currency and minimize her exposure to the local instability. That might mean she immediately starts accepting digital payments in crypto, or she moves her capital offshore through whatever mechanisms are available. She'll focus exclusively on international clients who can pay her in US dollars.
Her survival is tied to her personal agility.
It's a constant, exhausting cycle of adaptation and personal innovation just to stay afloat against this backdrop of a chaotic state. She's focused on maximizing her personal income and minimizing her systemic risk, and she's doing it completely on her own.
That speed and independence, it feels like it's driven by that complete lack of institutional trust, which ties right back to that extreme uncertainty avoidance. The institutions can't give her certainty, so she has to create her own little bubble of it.
That's the perfect way to describe it. Now let's look at Felipe in Brazil. He operates under a different kind of pressure. He's not necessarily dealing with hyperinflation every year, but he is facing the infamous Brazilian bureaucracy, what they call the Custo Brazil.
The Brazil costs.
Yes, and he can't just pivot around it like Valeria does. He has to go through it. And given his culture's high power distance and collectivism, how does he do that? He turns to his network. His panelinha.
Okay, let's define that term, panelinha, because it's often translated as just a clique or a social circle. But in the Brazilian business context, it's much more than that. Is it just a polite word for corruption, or is it more nuanced?
It's crucial to understand the nuance. Of course, the concept can enable corruption. There's no doubt about that. But the panelinha is often better understood as a necessary form of social capital, especially in a high PDI collectivist society. It's your strong in-group, the one that provides you with access, with trust, with that system of mutual obligation we talked about.
So Felipe uses this social capital to solve his problem.
He does. He's facing some regulatory blockade, so he leverages his relational capital. He calls his uncle, who happens to be connected to the local councilman, who knows the regulator who can unblock the permit. He solves a business problem not through the impersonal efficiency of the system,
but through a personalized social intervention.
That's the key. The Custo Brazil, the Brazil cost, is this massive burden of time and money that's imposed by incredibly complex, constantly shifting regulations, taxes, and red tape. I mean, some studies show that Brazilian companies can spend thousands of hours a year just trying to comply with tax laws.
It's a full-time job just to follow the rules.
And because the rules themselves are often so complex and ambiguous, even in a high UAI culture, the implementation is unclear. Felipe has to rely on his trusted network to interpret the rules for him, to help him bypass the bottlenecks, and to get the necessary permissions. And he does this by respecting the existing gatekeepers of authority. His survival depends entirely on the strength of his social web, not on his individual brilliance or the perfection of his business plan.
So what does this all mean for the bigger picture, for the macro stability of each country?
Well, the Argentine approach, driven by that intense individualism and the need to constantly mitigate extreme uncertainty, it produces these flashes of rapid personal innovation, but it's incredibly exhausting for the individual, and it does absolutely nothing to build long-term institutional stability. It's a culture that's perfectly designed for surviving in chaos, but not for ending it.
Where's the Brazilian approach?
The Brazilian approach, which relies on that collectivist safety net and deference to authority, often looks slow or bureaucratic to an outsider, but it offers a much greater potential for long-term institutional continuity. as long as you are inside the right social circle, of course. This reliance on personal yet hierarchical networks helps Brazil absorb and mediate its own institutional weaknesses in a way that Argentina, with its lone wolf culture, simply cannot.
That distinction you made between individual resilience and collective continuity, that's the perfect bridge to our next section. Let's look at how these cultural codes have actually played out on a national macro scale over the last century.
Right, because when we examine the economic histories of Brazil and Argentina since World War II, we are looking at two paths that started in a similar place but diverged in the most fundamental way.
And it's shocking to remember how much wealthier Argentina was at the beginning of that period.
It's astonishing. Right after the war, Argentina's per capita GDP was about 4 times that of Brazil's. It was a regional powerhouse.
Which makes the story that follows a clear catch-up story for Brazil.
It is, but it's a catch-up that was driven less by Brazil's own incredible acceleration in the 70s and 80s, and more by Argentina's profound and repeated economic crises. By the 1990s, Brazil had closed the gap significantly, reaching about half of Argentina's per capita GDP. But the really crucial finding here isn't the growth rate itself, it's the volatility.
Can you describe that volatility contrast for us?
Brazil's economic performance, looking at the whole period from 1950 to 2008, was on average better. But much more importantly, it was so much less volatile. Argentina's economy, on the other hand, is defined by these earthquake-like patterns. Sudden, massive peaks followed by catastrophic troughs.
Currency devaluations, hyperinflation, sovereign defaults.
And, of course, the complete systemic collapse of 2001. It's a history of shocks.
So what was driving that constant debilitating inconsistency in Argentina?
Well, part of it was structural. Argentina's economy was less diversified, which made it far more vulnerable to external shocks, especially the wild swings in commodity export prices. Brazil had invested more heavily in physical capital and in building a more diversified manufacturing base, so it was more insulated. But the real engine of this inconsistency, the thing underneath it all, is the deep-seated political and institutional instability that has characterized Argentina for decades.
Which points us directly back to that cultural craving for certainty that its own institutions perpetually failed to deliver. It's a vicious cycle.
It's the core cycle, and we can quantify that institutional failure by looking at the political stability rates. We can see what we call the political decoupling. We know both countries were highly unstable in the mid-20th century.
It was almost the norm for the region at the time.
It was. Up until about 1970, both were just riddled with coups and non-constitutional changes of government. Brazil had what we call an abnormality rate of 67% for its presidential periods. That means 2 out of every 3 presidents left office early or unconstitutionally. Argentina's rate was 53% in that same era, so both very unstable.
But then, after 1970, they split. Argentina just stayed on that chaotic path.
It did. Even after the military period ended and democracy returned, the turmoil continued unabated. Argentina's post-1966 abnormality rate remained at a staggering 67%. This made it one of the most politically unstable countries in the entire world during that era. Just repeated military interventions, forced resignations, a revolving door of interim rulers.
I mean, just stop and think what a 67% rate means for an average citizen, for a business owner. It fundamentally destroys any ability to make long-term plans. It undermines every single economic stabilization effort and just consistently erodes any trust in institutions.
Exactly. It prevents continuity. You can't make a 20-year investment in infrastructure, education reform, or economic diversification if you fully expect the entire rulebook to be thrown out and rewritten every 18 months. Now look at Brazil during that exact same period, post-1970.
Brazil found a way to become stable.
It switched to what the analysis calls a much more stable equilibrium. It's a dramatic shift. After 1969, only one president was removed from office, and even that was done through the established constitutional impeachment process. The abnormality rate plummeted from 67% down to just 9%.
9%.
9%. That's a level of political stability that matches the United States record over the same time frame. And notice the timing here. This shift to stability perfectly coincides with Brazil starting to really close that economic gap with Argentina.
So we have a really clear correlation. Political stability enabled the economic diversification that, in turn, reduced volatility. The big question then is why? What institutional change caused this fundamental shift in Brazil's political stability?
And that leads us directly to the Brasilia hypothesis,
which argues that it all comes down to moving the capital city.
It argues that the timing of Brazil's newfound stability lines up perfectly with the physical consolidation of the capital being transferred from the coastal metropolis of Rio de Janeiro to the new, isolated inland city of Brasilia. The official move happened in 1960, but the full migration of the government, the bureaucracy, the foreign embassies, that wasn't really complete and consolidated until the early 1970s.
So are we really suggesting that if Argentina had just moved its capital to, say, Cordoba back in the 1950s, its entire history could have been different?
The hypothesis suggests the potential for that is massive, yes. The core mechanism here is geographic. Political instability in weakly institutionalized countries like Argentina and mid-century Brazil is very often fueled by insurrections, by coups, by mass demonstrations that are centered in these incredibly dense capital cities. Think of Buenos Aires. Think of the old capital, Rio.
Why does that geographic concentration matter so much?
Because the success of an insurrection, or even just the effective pressure of a mass protest, relies heavily on the scale and density of the population that's concentrated right around the political center. If the presidential palace is right next door to the major labor unions, the student organizations, and huge urban populations, the cost of generating instability is extremely low. An insurrection can gain momentum very, very quickly.
Whereas an isolated capital like Brasilia.
An isolated capital is structurally insulated from that kind of sudden, chaotic, instability-inducing turbulence.
That makes perfect sense. Brasilia was literally engineered to be separate from the daily turbulence of urban life, from that overpopulation and political mobilization.
And the data backs this up completely. Brazil is ranked as the 12th least concentrated country in the world in terms of population around its capital. Argentina, in stark contrast, is ranked 140th. It's one of the most concentrated. And this wasn't an accident. President Kubitschek, who built Brasilia, explicitly said that the purpose of the move was to protect democracy from the constant turbulence that Rio's density used to generate.
And this mechanism helps explain why Argentina's instability remains so persistent even today. The concentration of all political power in Buenos Aires makes every austerity measure, every crisis, every protest, a direct, immediate threat to the government sitting in the Casa Rosada.
And we see that vulnerability playing out in real time. Argentina's economic history just continues to be defined by these recurring crises. The most recent political transition, the election of President Javier Milei in late 2023, immediately triggered the most extreme market reactions, all driven by that deep-seated fear and volatility.
What were the specific consequences of that transition?
You saw immediate, violent shocks to the currency. The Argentine peso experienced a depreciation of well over 100%. It plunged from around, say, 350 to 400 pesos per US dollar right before the election to over 800 pesos to the dollar very shortly afterward in early 2024.
But at the same time, the stock market initially soared.
Yeah, it did. The Merval index shot up. That was based on initial investor enthusiasm for his radical platform of deregulation, privatization of state companies, and other pro-business reforms. There was a moment of optimism.
A moment of optimism that quickly met reality. How did that translate into the market cooling off?
Well, throughout early 2025, we saw a subsequent sharp decline in the Merval. And this wasn't just investors taking profits. It signaled a genuine fear of policy errors, of financial instability, and most critically, of social unrest. The severe austerity measures that the government championed, things like massive cuts to subsidies for utilities and transportation, were met with immediate, powerful, and concentrated opposition.
And because of that geographical concentration in Buenos Aires, the government is under constant, direct pressure from the population.
Exactly. The austerity has already provoked mass demonstrations, general strikes organized by the powerful labor unions, and strong political opposition from provincial governors who are feeling the pain of these cuts. The market's fear is that this localized but incredibly dense political turbulence in Buenos Aires will make the necessary, painful economic reforms politically impossible to sustain. And that will force yet another policy reversal and perhaps another default. Argentina just remains stuck in this volatile equilibrium where its political geography feeds its economic chaos. Meanwhile, Brazil used geography to escape that very trap.
So if these cultural codes are so deeply ingrained, so powerful, how does the modern world, I'm thinking specifically about digitalization and globalization, how does it interact with them? Is the internet this irresistible force that's just flattening these traditional hierarchies, or does it end up just supercharging the national traits that are already there?
It seems to be doing both at the same time, which is what's so interesting. The sources suggest this duality. Digital tools can act like a cultural solvent. eroding some traditions in one country while intensely reinforcing the existing preferences in the other. Let's take Brazil's high power distance, that PDI of 69.
In a traditional Brazilian company, let's say 20 years ago, bypassing your immediate boss to talk to a director would be unthinkable. It would be a huge violation of the social contract.
A career-limiting move, absolutely. The protocol was rigid, information flow was meant to be vertical, contained within channels, mediated by status. But then you introduce a tool like Slack.
Which is inherently horizontal.
Inherently horizontal. And there's this great anecdote about junior developers at a legacy Brazilian bank who implemented Slack. Suddenly, you have a 22-year-old developer sending a direct message to the vice president of engineering in a public channel to report a bug or suggest a fix.
And in doing so, they've just bypassed 3 layers of middle management.
That's the cultural collision right there. And it forces the corporate culture to adapt. It has to accept a more egalitarian, more direct flow of information because it's being influenced by the global standards of the tech industry. Now, the older, high PDI managers might be very psychologically uncomfortable with this.
But they can't deny the speed and the efficiency benefits.
They can't. So the organization is forced to move, however reluctantly, toward flattening its own hierarchy just to stay globally competitive. Technology, in this case, is acting as a leveler. It's chipping away at those rigid power structures.
So in Brazil, technology forces a reduction in hierarchy. What happens at the same time in Argentina, a country that already values individualism so highly?
In Argentina, those same digital forces are like pouring gasoline on the fire of individualism. The rise of the gig economy, the explosion of remote work, these have given Argentine professionals an unprecedented tool to maximize their personal income and, crucially, to completely bypass their own local economic uncertainty.
They're using globalization as a shield to insulate themselves from their unstable local system.
Precisely. You have these highly educated, highly skilled professionals, coders, designers, consultants, who are leveraging digital platforms to get remote contracts with international companies. And those companies pay them in hard, stable currency, like US dollars.
Which allows them to function as these self-reliant individual economic units.
It supercharges their individualism and their achievement drive. Their goal becomes total personal autonomy and the maximization of their own income. And this cultural preference, which is now enabled by remote work, is pushing traditional concepts like company loyalty toward complete obsolescence. And loyalty was already fragile in Argentina because of the lack of institutional trust.
Why would you commit to a local company paying in a volatile currency when your allegiance can be purely transactional and international?
You wouldn't. They are doubling down on that me against the world self-reliant mindset that their culture has fostered for generations.
That is a profound divergence in how 2 neighboring cultures react to the exact same global force. It also raises some big questions about how Brazilian multinational corporations, or MNCs, manage their own global footprint, given their high PDI and collectivist roots.
Well, historically, Latin American MNCs in general tended to dominate in one of 2 areas, either resource-seeking, think oil, food, mining, or market-seeking, which was mostly focused on conquering neighboring countries on a regional scale. And Brazilian MNCs often operated in these big commoditized sectors like steel, petrochemicals, and food processing, where they could leverage their local resource advantages.
But did their cultural profile, that high power distance and collectivism, did that inhibit their ability to manage complex global operations? It seems like it would be a challenge.
It's a great question, and the research suggests that their interaction with global operations actually forced them to change, especially when it came to decision-making. You're right that high power distance back home should theoretically make international operations very difficult because local managers in, say, Germany or the US would be reluctant to make autonomous decisions if they're used to a different system.
They'd be waiting for an order from São Paulo that might never come.
Exactly. But surprisingly, the individualism collectivism factor seems to have had a smoothing effect.
A smoothing effect. What does that mean in practice?
It means that as these Brazilian companies globalize and they're forced to operate in diverse markets with much lower power distance cultures like the US or Europe, they have to adapt. The cultural emphasis on collectivism, on getting group consensus, ends up neutralizing the hardline top-down effect of their high power distance.
So they're forced to decentralize their decision-making.
They have to. They have to foster more collaborative management styles just to compete effectively in those markets. So while the company is still guided by a sense of respect for authority, the group dynamic pressures that authority to listen and collaborate more than they might have to back home. It's a fascinating, enforced cultural evolution.
But are Brazilian MNCs still stuck in that old resource and market-seeking model, or is their global strategy evolving?
Their strategic profile is definitely shifting. It has to, because they're facing such intense global competition in those commoditized sectors. The traditional advantages of just having cheap resources or a big local market aren't enough anymore. So now we're seeing this concerted shift toward more advanced global strategies.
Such as?
A key movement we're seeing is the acquisition of competitors in Western Europe and the United States. And this isn't just about simple market expansion. It indicates a real turning point, a move toward what we call efficiency-seeking and strategic asset-seeking strategies.
So instead of just selling Brazilian steel, they're now buying a U.S. logistics firm or a specialty German manufacturer.
Exactly. They are actively seeking to acquire essential assets, skills, and advanced technology that they need to compete on a global stage. Things like sophisticated supply chain management expertise, established Western brand names, high-end quality control processes, and R&D capabilities. This transition from just using their local advantages to actively acquiring strategic, non-resource-based assets from abroad is absolutely essential for their long-term survival against the entrenched global players in the 21st century.
This entire deep dive into the cultural operating systems of Argentina and Brazil has it's revealed that the differences between them aren't superficial at all. They're foundational. They go right to the core.
They really do. You have Brazil, which found a path to political and subsequently economic stability through a massive structural and geographic change, the isolation of Brasilia. And it continues to rely on these strong collective networks and a very clear hierarchy to function, both socially and in business.
And then you have Argentina, which remains defined by this incredible individual resilience, a powerful drive for personal achievement, and this constant cultural craving for documented certainty and structure.
A craving that is constantly frustrated by its own inability to overcome this deep, enduring institutional and economic volatility, a volatility that's rooted, as we've seen, in its concentrated political geography.
So that moment of awkward silence on that project kickoff call we started with, it wasn't just a simple communication breakdown. It was the core collision between two completely antithetical approaches to governance, to business, to life. The Argentine team, driven by their high uncertainty avoidance, desperately needed the plan to feel in control of a chaotic future.
While the Brazilian team, driven by their high-powered distance and collectivism, prioritized the tribe, the human network, to navigate the complexities of the present. And this deeply, deeply different approach to risk, to power, and to social organization is what has shaped the wildly distinct economic and political histories of these two neighboring giants. Understanding whether a culture is looking for a rigid plan or a reliable tribe is really the definitive key to successfully navigating Latin America's two largest and most complex economies.